Hi, I am so happy that Yarimar agreed to do this. Thank you so much, speaking to us from Puerto Rico. I came up with a bunch of questions that I thought would help to frame the discussion. So I'm just going to dive right in and start out by asking if, Yarimar, you could tell us a little bit about the really key, the central social, political, and economic issues that Hurricane Maria brought into relief for Puerto Ricans and for the rest of us.
Okay, thank you. Well, first, let me thank you all for the invitation and thank everyone who's logged on to view this. I know you have your choice in live streaming, so I appreciate you joining us. And I really want to thank Coco for doing this. It's such an honor to be with you. I always remember the first time I encountered your work when I was a grad student in New Mexico, and you were performing your book, English is Broken Here, had just come out, and it was incredibly formative and mind-blowing for me. So, and I've always followed your work since. So thank you so much for this conversation. And, we're here just about a week or two. I don't know, I've lost sense of time, but just very shortly after the 3rd anniversary of Hurricane Maria. So certainly an appropriate time to revisit these questions. And, you asked me what the storm revealed, which is something that I've been really interested in. And I think, one of, that question is what it revealed different things for different people, obviously. And I think for a lot of people in the United States, it revealed Puerto Rico. There were so many people still in the United States that don't know that there is this, island, an archipelago of islands of US citizens, and what their relationship is, how they come to have that relationship to the United States, and something that I always stress with my students too, why that relationship benefits the US. And so for me, it's been a productive time in the sense that before Maria, it was really difficult to find spaces in mainstream media and mainstream public sphere to talk about the colonial relationship of Puerto Rico and the United States, and to talk about the United States as an empire. And I think that Hurricane Maria has really cleared, the ground and opened up some space. A lot of people found themselves saying, wait, why do we have these territories, right? And so that, I think, has really opened up the debate. And since Hurricane Maria, we've seen more politicians having to publicly take a stand on not just on, kind of vaguely wishing well to Puerto Ricans, but having to really take a stand on the political relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. And we now have a bill in Congress put forth by Nidia Velázquez and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, asking for a really historic change in the way the question is addressed. In the past, there's been these local plebiscites in Puerto Rico about the political relationship between the US and Puerto Rico. But this bill that is now proposed, forces the United States to speak openly and directly about the relationship that it has, the relationship it wants to have, and what it's open to in terms of decolonizing Puerto Rico. So I think overall, Hurricane Maria, both in the United States and in Puerto Rico, which I want to talk about as well, created, lifted the veil off of colonialism. And in Puerto Rico, that had already began a little bit earlier with the debt crisis and the imposition of a fiscal control board, where it became clear, both in these acts and also in the statements made by the US government in imposing this fiscal board and refusing to allow Puerto Ricans to renegotiate their own debt or file for bankruptcy, that Puerto Rico did not have sovereignty. And so before Hurricane Maria, this was already being debated in the legal spheres. And there were, the 2016 gubernatorial elections in Puerto Rico was the first time that I saw gubernatorial candidates being asked to take a position on Puerto Rico's, what they were going to do to solve Puerto Rico's colonial problem. It used to be that it was only pro-independence activists, people in the extreme left, who would say that Puerto Rico was a colony. And so beginning in 2016, that became, more mainstream. And you had already, before Hurricane Maria, displays of the Puerto Rican flag in black and white. that some described as a symbol of mourning, a symbol of the death of this kind of political promise of decolonization, and others saw as a symbol of resistance. And so you had all of that already happening when Hurricane Maria blows through. So Puerto Ricans were already in a kind of, you can describe it as a moment of awakening, a moment of shift, of change. And then Maria comes through, and it also dispels one other important myth, which was that in Puerto Rico, a lot of people thought that part of the benefits of being part of the United States was FEMA, and all these Caribbean societies have to deal with hurricanes, have to deal with these constant threats increasing in the era of climate change. And so Hurricane Maria revealed to Puerto Ricans that federal safety net that we were always told was so important and so beneficial and kind of worth dealing with all the negative aspects of the colonial relationship with the US, to have that safety net. Like, oh, well, this is not really that useful. And just this past week, new statistics were revealed about how FEMA has aided in the wake of the earthquakes that took place in Puerto Rico at the beginning of the year. And the great majority of people have been denied federal assistance, both in Hurricane Maria and in these earthquakes. So it really kind of revealed the colonial relationship and the limits of that colonial relationship. Now, internally for Puerto Ricans as well, I think it also revealed not just the limits of the federal state, but the limits of the local state as well. And so Puerto Ricans were kind of left to fend for themselves by both of these state apparatus. And so I think it's really brought into question overall, what kind of society do we want to have? What relationship do we want to have to the state, both a federal state and a local state? And I mean, the answer to some of that we saw last summer in Puerto Rico when there was a mass uprising to get rid of the local governor. And so I think, it's been an incredible time of change, of possibility, of devastation, and of trauma as well. And now, adding on to that, the pandemic. But I think, I've been saying that in some ways, COVID-19 has been the United States Hurricane Maria moment, in the sense of discovering your government, discovering who you can count on, and all of that. So I think just as in the US, this moment of so much trauma and so much pain has also led to so much uprising and unmasking of a lot of things that were kind of there, but not necessarily talked about, or not necessarily talked about in the same way. I think in Puerto Rico has also been a time of real political awakening.
Thank you. You made a wonderful film that shows, I guess, how different people on the island are negotiating with this very difficult reality that they're experiencing now, and that accompanies your writing and kind of shows us the people who in some ways have been informants for your research, I would imagine. One of the things that surprised me about the film was that you really focused on community-based responses to the hurricane, whereas the news that I was watching after the hurricane focused very much on the governor of Puerto Rico, on the mayor of San Juan, on the it was much more of a top-down view of, do these political leaders, are they doing something, and not on what people are doing. So can you tell us a little bit about how it is and why it is that you focus your research and your film on community-based responses to the situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone that is featured in the film were people that contributed to the book Aftershocks of Disaster that I co-edited with Marisol Lebron. And the film, I asked my friend Juan Carlos Davila, who is a wonderful filmmaker, that I've enjoyed his short films and his longer films as well. I said, I would really like to do some kind of video. I thought it would be like an 8-minute video, like a kind of trailer. But and he was the one who said, well, let's interview a person from each section of the book. And it became a kind of text on its own that I think tells its own story. And so the people in the film are, my collaborators, but they're folks that have their own projects. So there's artists, writers, journalists, photographers, photojournalists, poets, and community activists. I mean, and it's hard to many of them wear several of those hats, right? And so the film begins with a colleague who's a professor at the University of Puerto Rico, but who runs a legal and psychological clinic. She's a psychology professor in a community in Canóvanas, and it ends with Giovanni Roberto, who runs a soup kitchen, sort of a community center, mutual aid center in Caguas. And so I think, you know, I really wanted to anchor it in those community spaces, because I think that's, you know, that's where the action is. You know, when the government stalled and abandoned folks, you know, people turned to their families and to their communities. And so, you know, these spaces were essential they took on basically state roles. You know, they were feeding people, giving them information, giving them shelter. Quickly it became apparent that donations given to the government were either being stolen or abandoned. We later found a bunch of wagons of food and bottles of water abandoned in an airstrip. They weren't getting to where they needed to get to. And so a lot of people who wanted to send aid, especially folks in the diaspora, and we have, you know, one of those stories in the film as well of how people in the diaspora, they mobilized their resources, and it was through these community organizations that they were able to funnel help. And it was really the diaspora who are the first responders, not FEMA, not the local government, not the mayor of San Juan either, who, you know, has been very celebrated in the United States for the way that she bravely challenged Trump. And we do appreciate her words and how she spoke about, you know, she kind of voiced the anger that a lot of us felt. But, you know, she wasn't really the one that was handing out food and helping people. You know, it was really these community activists that took the charge and have helped in this rethinking of the role of the state, you know, and of the role of also in a place where we've been colonized and we've been told that we can't be self-sufficient, that we are dependent. These projects of autogestión, they are a kind of self-determination or self, you know, self-management that have become really, really important for imagining different political alternatives right now.
Well, agreed. And they're really interesting people to listen to and to learn about what they're doing. But I want to go in my next question back to the question of the government again, because I remember being really stunned and moved by the mass protests in Puerto Rico in 2019 against the governor. And I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about, like, so what is the kind of response of the citizenry to the governor or the government since that time? Because, I mean, it was astonishing how, well, first of all, how culture worked in, you know, within the protest. I was just really amazed by music, theater, poetry, everything, but also this mass mobilization. So can you talk a little bit about what's happened in the relationship to the government?
So, you know, I've written before about social movements, and I always say, you know, they're followed by great disappointment, partly because you have this moment of collective effervescence and this moment of realizing that things you never imagined could be possible. And this time, you know, the piece that we circulated to the students talks a lot about the process of waiting and how there was this kind of this temporality, you know, and how time was used as a tool of governance, you know, forcing people to wait, these dragged out wait, which I'm sure now a lot of people can understand with the pandemic, right? This feeling of expanded time. And so after that, there was suddenly this accelerated time where in two weeks, you know, like we suddenly went from being mad at the governor to like and not accepting anything other than his resignation. And so and people were kind of drunk with power as collectives and wanted to keep going. And my colleague Rocio Zambrana, she's written about the checklist, that there were all these signs that people carried in the protest that had checklists of everything they wanted to get rid of. So first Ricky, then the junta, then Wanda, then Rivera Chats, then all these things, right? And so there was a real sense that getting rid of the governor was the beginning, was not the end. But then immediately after, there was this power play within the PMP party, the party in power, about who would succeed the governor, because the Secretary of State had also resigned in disgrace with all the scandals, and there was not because then the next person in line was too young illegally, like, so there was like all this stuff going on. And so someone, Ricky Rosselló, designated someone else, Pedro Pierluisi, who is now running for governor under the PMP party again. And Pedro Pierluisi like swore himself in as governor, and there was just all this power grab that really distracted everyone. And then the governor, the Supreme Court found that was unconstitutional, not illegal, but unconstitutional. And so he stepped down. And then Wanda Vázquez became the governor. And I think all that shenanigans, distracted people. But at the same time, a lot of one man I interviewed, he said, they're having their internal power play, and when your enemy is fighting internally, you leave them alone. Mm-hmm. So there was this sense like, let them beat each other up, and fight over power. And so people then waited, and since in many ways the PMP party didn't want Wanda Vázquez to be governor, people were like, well, you know what? We're going to let her be governor. We're going to see what happens. And they waited. But then the earthquakes happened, and she proved to be, just as lack of, having the similar lack of empathy. She also played politics with aid after the earthquake. And a whole host of other reasons people were upset with her, and so she lost the primaries. And so a lot of people right after Wanda, when people started to get upset with Wanda, they took to the streets again, and there were graffiti in the streets again, like, let's get rid of Wanda, let's call for her resignation. And some folks were like, no, let's wait, it's really close to the elections, we will clean house in the elections. But part of the problem is that there's, people feel like they don't see what they want on the ballot, like the options presented to them are none of them are truly satisfying. But I think that all of that community organization and all of that action has led people to not imagine the ballot box as the sole side of politics. And so first of all, I think people are more willing to take risks than they were in the past. And I usually don't predict elections. I'm not in that game or anything predictive of that sort. But I feel pretty confident that in the next election, the non-traditional parties, there's Victoria Ciudadana, which is a coalition party. There's also the Independence Party, which has never won the gubernatorial seat. I think we're going to see those parties having more votes than ever. And one of our most famous celebrities right now, Bad Bunny, he got his electoral card and encouraged young people to vote. And he said he was going to choose from those alternative candidates. So I see this election as a kind of first step for thinking beyond traditional politics, for also shaking the political parties, because the political parties, after the governor stepped down, they thought, okay, well, now back to business as usual. And they've been the last ones to realize the political awakening that has taken place in Puerto Rico. So although, as I said, it's a very long answer to your question. So the short answer is there's a lot of disappointment. But the long answer is that there's also a lot of organizing and a lot of possibility. And I think viewing it with a kind of long view, I think that this is just the beginning of longer political transformations in Puerto Rico, especially as the status question also gets a kind of new possibility to be posed in a different way.
Okay, thank you. I want to shift again, this time to talk in a little bit more of a theoretical way, because I think that you have an approach to understanding the formation of identity in Puerto Rico and in the Caribbean that's really important for all of us to understand. And I'm going to focus my question on how you use the term ratio colonial. And because the way that, at least what I understand from it, is that you want us to see that Puerto Ricans get racialized through the politics of coloniality. and I think it's really important that you map out that process through that term. Because I think it helps to break down a false idea that all Latin Americans belong to one racial group, which is unfortunately a misinterpretation that many maintain here in the United States. But also that the way that you use it helps us understand that race is a kind of arbitrary system that's imposed on people. It's not your reality in a kind of unmediated way. So I would really like you to kind of walk us through your understanding of this terminology.
Yeah, so this is kind of a practice of mine. Like I try to never really talk about race or colonialism separately, because I think that they are fundamentally entwined and they're co-constitutive. So on the one hand, I think it's hard to talk about race as if it was not generated by the colonial project. The very way in which the creation of a second class of humans, and people who were shut out of humanity, like that was part of New World discovery, and of justifying the exploration, the conquest, the settlement, and the appropriation of lands and peoples and resources. And so anytime I'm talking about race, I'm also talking about coloniality. And similarly with colonialism, so the way in which Puerto Ricans are a colonial population, that means that they are inherently a racialized community. And so part of what I tried to do in the piece that circulated was to think about how the way Puerto Rico was treated after Hurricane Maria puts it into what I describe as an archipelago of neglect that connects Puerto Rico to New Orleans, but also connects it to Haiti, connects it to all these different places that are racialized in their treatment after a disaster. And so how, in the case of Maria, you can compare it to the way which other communities that were struck by Irma or Harvey in that same hurricane season received incredibly different treatment, right? And so and how to understand what is at stake for Puerto Rico in its recovery. We can't look at how Texas recovered after Harvey. We have to look at New Orleans after Katrina, or Haiti after its 2010 earthquake. And if we are to look at Texas, we have to look at how Latino communities in Texas have bounced or not bounced back after Harvey, because it's been disproportionately, racialized communities that are consistently denied FEMA assistance, left to fend for themselves, and forced. And I wanted to say this was the other thing that was discovered during Maria, unfortunately, by the local government, was the whole notion of resilience. So, what are the populations that are repeatedly called upon again and again to be resilient, and I really wanted to write against this. And I've written also about this in the Puerto Rican newspaper, because, and this happened in New Orleans after Katrina as well, when people started saying that resilience was the R word, and this trope of how we have to be strong, and it gets tied up with the language of climate change. We also have to be sustainable and all these things, and it sounds positive, but it becomes a kind of selling point for endurance. And so people are called upon to become habituated, to be able to bounce back after blow of structural violence. And I witnessed Ricardo Rosselló, the governor that was ousted, I witnessed him selling Puerto Rico to investors and saying, we have a resilient population. They've gone like a year without electricity. Imagine how hard you can work them in your factories, So this kind of imposition of resilience, which we also see with the COVID pandemic. I mean, who are the frontline workers? Who are the essential workers that are called upon to be resilient and to have to continue to fill grocery store aisles or deliver food or, run school buses? These are very particular communities that are called upon to be uncelebrated heroes and who are risking their lives without the kind of payment that other, heroes get. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to also connect Puerto Rico, its experience after the hurricane, to the experience of those workers in the U.S. as well.
Thank you. I want to ask, maybe kind of help all of us to understand the most recent exodus post Hurricane Maria in a historical continuum, because after the hurricane, you know, there was a lot of news here about how over 100,000 Puerto Ricos moved to Orlando, for example. Oh my God, so many Puerto Ricans. Well, you know, there were a lot of Puerto Ricans came to New York in the 1950s. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of these catastrophes that generate mass migration from Puerto Rico?
Yeah, yeah. So migration has always been a kind of escape valve in Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico is one of the few places that had migration as a kind of economic development program. So in the 50s, when the U.S. government was trying to showcase Puerto Rico as a model of U.S.-led development and industry and progress, all of that hinged on Puerto Rico exporting massive amounts of its people, particularly former agricultural workers who were dispossessed and who then had to, you know, board government organized flights to the United States and many to the East Coast to work in factories, but also as far flung as Hawaii without necessarily knowing it. To work in agriculture, to work in factories, to work in steel mills. And so that exodus, you know, and this is part of when people talk about what place does the contemporary diaspora have in the contemporary political debates in Puerto Rico. I think it's important to know that these folks were exiled, these folks were exported. You know, this wasn't a voluntary migration, and there are generations that have always kept their connection to Puerto Rico and have always dreamed of coming back, and there have been a lot of return migrants, you know, from those migratory waves. So you had this big historic wave in the 50s and 60s in that early moment of industrialization in Puerto Rico, and then as you started to have the economic crisis that came to its peak in 2016, you were seeing once again these new massive waves of migration, and to the point where now there are more Puerto Ricans in the mainland US than there are in the archipelago of Puerto Rico. And so I think, you know, it's clear that every time that government policies here are failing, this is one of their fallbacks, is to export and sacrifice their population. And this is part of what many of the young people who were protesting the governor last summer, I saw a lot of signs where people said, I don't want to migrate. I don't want to join my sister in the diaspora. I want to be able to start a life here and imagine my future here. And so that's really what's at stake for a lot of Puerto Ricans who are protesting now, is to have schools, to have a university, to have public roads and lighting and jobs, and to be able to stay in Puerto Rico and to not have to imagine their future elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to switch now to ask a question that really moved me, and I think will move many of the members of the Cooper community as artists and as image makers, which is about the ethics of taking photographs in a catastrophic situation in which people are traumatized or really, you know, harmed at many levels and in many ways. In the film that you made, there's a scene where a photographer talks about the kind of the questions that she asked herself, right? About is it okay, and under what conditions would it be okay, and what does it mean to take pictures, and how can I take a picture that isn't going to reproduce a certain kind of stereotype? I'm wondering if you could talk about that, because I know that many of the artists in Puerto Rico have this on their minds, but also we also up here have that question on our minds.
Yeah, so the photographer you're referencing is Erika Rodriguez, and she's featured in the book. She was one of the main you know, lenses in Puerto Rico. Her photographs appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and so you know, really, and she's a very young woman, and you know, I think she brings a really unique perspective. So like when you think image of a hurricane, it's not necessarily the images that she's producing. And many of the images that she produces are portraits of families in their homes, and not the image of just people in the rubble. And so in the film, she talks about how, you know, her her work, she identifies specifically as a photojournalist. And so she's more familiar with these debates than I am, but she talks about how within photojournalism, there's this sense of a kind of a real story, a truth, you know, that you're just there to document. And obviously you're not supposed to tamper with that in any way, because at one point I said, why didn't you Photoshop this out? And she's like, no, you know, I can't tamper this in any way. And so that might lead you to just be like, well, this woman is having a breakdown here in the rubble. This is the story. This is the truth. This is the photo I'm going to take. And she says that her approach is quite different, and one that she's learned from her mentors of you know, asking herself, is this photo necessary? You know, and I think that's such an important question to ask. You know, she's like, do I need to document this woman having a breakdown? Is that the story? You know, just because it happened and just because it's the truth, is that the image that I need to capture? And she also talks about how she says she's a little tortuga. She's like a turtle, very slow in her work. That she, you know, she really takes her time. She doesn't just start, you know, using the shutter. And she says that a lot of the work that she does is to arrive, to talk to people, to get situated, which, I mean, for me as an anthropologist, that obviously makes sense. But I guess there are photojournalists that arrive and just start taking pictures without talking to people. And so for her, it's really important for it to also be dialogical, which is something that Chris Gregory, who's also featured in the book, in his piece in the book, he talks about portraiture as a kind of relationship between the person that you're photographing and the photographer. And so, you know, both of them and the other artists that are featured in the book and the writers as well, you know, they all reflect about the challenges of narration, and the challenges of, you know, how do we describe, represent, narrate this moment? Also, how do we interview people who are traumatized, you know? And so Benjamin Torres Gotay, he talks about interviewing people, well, you know, in roofless homes with no FEMA assistance, and they'd be like, no, I'm okay. You know? So, you know, the challenges of capturing this moment was what I wanted to, you know, represent in the book and in the film.
Mm-hmm. I'm really glad that you brought up this notion of the dialogical, because I think that is a model that we can really work with as artists, to think about how we can relate to others. I think many are afraid that, oh, you know, I don't want to abuse somebody, or I don't want to misrepresent someone. But you know, those questions can be resolved through interaction, through productive and fruitful interaction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And as an anthropologist, that's something that, you know, I talk to people about the work that I'm doing, how they wish to be represented, and how they see things, you know? So to not just let them be the object of representation, but to have an involvement in the argument that you are making with those representations. And so, and that's why, you know, also it was really important for me that my first book after Hurricane Maria not be my voice, but actually be a collection of voices and viewpoints, and particularly voices that are not often read in English. And so to create this dialogue and this multiplicity of perspectives, because that's the other thing that it's so hard to capture what Maria was, you know, it was so many things and for so many different people. And so I think the only way to get at it, especially in you know, this collection, it came out just 2 years after the hurricane, is still to just, you know, sift through these different experiences, many of which have not been reconciled. And, you know, we had our 3rd anniversary, and I know a lot of people who are still unable to process it, you know, and unsure of what is the appropriate way to mark this occasion, you know. It still is not passed. That's the other thing, and that's why I had chosen the title of Aftershocks for the conference that gave way to this volume, and for the volume and now the film, because it's this idea of these kind of repetitive jolts, and now that they, you know, they kind of morphed into the earthquake, which just today, you know, there were 2 earthquakes in the southern coast of Puerto Rico of over 4-point magnitude, and then the pandemic, you know. And so it has felt like really relentless in Puerto Rico, the kind of you know, hit after hit. And I know in the media sometimes, you know, people ask me, oh, Puerto Rico can't catch a break. And I'm like, it's not the lotto, you know, like this isn't a matter of luck. This is structural violence playing out, you know, and this is how things have been set up. This is what happens when you impose austerity politics, when you gut all government services, when you neglect public health, when you neglect the school system to the point where there are, all these children in the southern coast of Puerto Rico who've not had a single day of school in 2020. And so when you completely abandon populations and in this matter, yeah, they can't catch a break, because you've broken the system. But I try to stay hopeful that it's also a moment of political possibility. I always try to keep that in mind as well.
This seems like a good moment to ask you about the very peculiar and special conditions that Puerto Rico has in relation to debt, because it is absolutely I'm not sure how many of us outside of Puerto Rico really understand how crazy it is. But you need to understand that to understand how you get to where things are now with all these expats living there. So can you explain what's going on with the debt thing?
Yeah, so in the 1950s, when Puerto Rico's economy was, propped up to the world as a model of successful US-led development, that was done in great part by giving tax breaks to U.S. companies who came here, didn't pay any taxes, paid very low wages, but then at a certain point, so that was going on, and then at the same time, Puerto Rico, written into its constitution, was the fact that it had to pay its debt obligations above any kind of public services. So it became a kind of safe, the kind of safest investment you could make because they were obliged to pay the debt. Then on top of that, Puerto Rican bonds were made incredibly desirable because they were triple tax exempt, which means you didn't have.
Puerto Rico owe money to at the time? Sorry to interrupt.
Well, but this was first set up before it went into debt. So it was set up in its relationship to the United States as a site of speculation, as a site of foreign investment, and as a very safe bet for people in the US. And some of these people who in the US who bought Puerto Rican bonds because they were incredibly lucrative, also to the people selling them, the people on Wall Street, these were people who were doing their 401ks, some of them were not, maybe even some of us, had in our retirement packages without knowing them. So, but all of this was set up. And then in the 1980s, again, Puerto Rico can't catch a break. It was mysteriously written out of the bankruptcy code in a way that nobody has been able to explain. And people make it seem like, oh, it was just written out. Like, things aren't accidentally written out. You purposefully write things out, right? And so it was set up so that it could not default on its debt. It could not go bankrupt. And it had to pay its debt obligations above everything else. So that kind of debt infrastructure is created. And then in the 90s, suddenly the US government says that it's going to stop its tax incentives for US companies. And so all those US companies who were here, they started to leave. And so you have right now you have all these abandoned factories in Puerto Rico. Like Puerto Rico, you walk around and you're walking around in ruins. There are these oil refineries that are just like sitting there contaminating the place. And so you had this like exodus. And then in order to sustain the economy in the face of that, the local politicians, they played a role in terms of borrowing heavily. And then Wall Street played a role in terms of, setting insane interest rates, the equivalent of payday loans. So all of that together created this huge debt that then at the same time, Puerto Rico wasn't able to renegotiate or declare bankruptcy to deal with its creditors. And so that's when the Fiscal Control Board is put into place. And we've had a stay on paying the debt for the past several years because of the fiscal board. And yet these packages of austerity have been put into place to the point that I don't know what's going to happen when we do start paying the debt. They keep threatening that there's going to be increased rates for the utilities, for electricity and water, which are already higher than anywhere else in the United States. Also, the sales tax here is higher than anywhere else in the United States, and the wages are much lower than anywhere else in the United States. So we're really in a kind of unsustainable economic position. And so that's why a lot of activists are rallying for the audit of the debt, because they feel that the way in which the debt was carried out was unconstitutional, was odious, and there's chapters about this in the Aftershocks book. And so, but the local government has refused to audit the debt. They don't want it to be revealed, how exactly this debt accumulated. And so that's still something that's being battled in the courts right now. And it remains to be seen.
So just so that, because I want to make sure I understand this and everybody else understands it. So basically it's public officials borrowing money from the US government to provide for public services. Is that where the debt comes?
But not borrowing from the US government, borrowing from Wall Street.
Wall Street to pay for public services.
To pay for the creation of infrastructure, like there was a massive coliseum that was created, an urban train, like a kind of monorail that is a complete waste of money, like that now like circles empty. And some of it, legitimate, useful things, but a lot of it not useful things. And the rates are particularly troubling. And also there's concern that there's been a lot of corruption in the government, and that some of that borrowed money also went to contracts for, party donors, etc.
Right. No, just theoretically, one does not use loans from Wall Street to pay for public works. That's supposed to come from tax. So it is it's absolutely crazy that anybody in government would have done this. And I'm sure that this was not done with the approval of the citizenry either, or the knowledge of the citizenry. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So then we get to a situation where it becomes somebody else's fun in a way to take on that. It's the expats, right, who are now supposed to be the solution. So can you tell us, because when I started reading about like wealthy people coming and kind of declaring residency in Puerto Rico after the hurricane, I was like, what is this? So can you explain why they're there, and also why they don't have to pay taxes?
Yeah, I mean, some of them don't understand fully why they don't have to pay taxes. They're kind of like, is this, are you for real? And when people critique them, so this was set up in 2012 by the government in place at that time to attract high net worth individuals. And the idea was that as Puerto Rico entered into this debt crisis, where Wall Street was not going to be loaning the money anymore, they said, well, maybe we can attract these folks to make capital investments here. And so they gave them tax incentives that are not available anywhere else in the United States. And so some of these people are like, oh, okay, and they don't have to live here the whole year. They only have to live here about half the year. And so the idea is that these folks are going to come, they're going to invest, renovate apartment complexes, invest in I don't know what, maybe build back up manufacturing. Whatever the idea was, it didn't come to be. So you have these folks who live here, who live in enclaves, like in these resorts. Sadly, a lot of them live in Palmas del Mar, which was a resort that was created for the Puerto Rican middle class. And as that middle class has shrunk, now it's these, outsiders who are enjoying those beautiful apartments. Others live in Dorado. There's a community in Rincon as well, and many in San Juan and Condado. And, they're supposed to generate jobs, but many of these folks, they're like these digital nomads. They don't have big companies, they don't create a lot of jobs. They maybe pay someone to clean their house, and they're not leaving a lot of money here. And so it's a very unpopular policy that a lot of people here oppose. and that perhaps will be revisited by a future administration. But until now, they don't have to pay any taxes until 2035.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we need to open this up and take questions from others, because my head is just kind of going like this, just thinking about the absurdity of some of the solutions, the proposed solutions, or that end up being non-solutions that have contributed to the situation of Puerto Rico in the present. But thanks, and I guess Omar and Leslie, maybe we should open up and take questions.
Yes, thank you. We already have questions coming in.
Okay.
So I will ask the first question. This is an anonymous person, did not leave their name, but asking specifically, how do you grapple with talking with individuals during such an emotionally difficult time? I think you touched on this in the context of speaking about the making of the film. Coco also asked about this in terms of, photographing under the conditions of disaster. And just, I think this person also moved into the space of just concern for the labor that individuals are putting themselves through in the context of struggling to survive. So your research versus the reality of the individual who you're engaging.
So first of all, since Maria, I've been working a lot with local researchers, especially students from the University of Puerto Rico. And so they're really, collaborators with me in terms of designing our questions, thinking about our strategies. And we always, when we interview people, we bring them information, especially at the beginning where there was such misinformation. We brought them phone numbers of community organizations, also phone numbers, how to deal with FEMA, etc. We also created like a Spanish translation and summary of the Promesa law that put into place the Fiscal Control Board. And so we try to use our encounters with folks as exchanges where we would listen to what they were going through. I think in some ways, a lot of people, when someone like an anthropologist comes up and listens to them, these are people who don't often get listened to, and it breaks my heart. But often at the end of an interview, they thank me, for my time when obviously, like, this is my job, but I think to be listened to and not judged, and to have empathy expressed, and also any support that we could offer, we would offer. And I think maybe the particularity of me and my team, we're all Puerto Ricans, we're all dealing with our own traumas, and we would break down crying with folks as well. And so I think it was an exchange that was also a form of healing for all of us involved, and to really, it would be less of an interview than more of thinking together about what we were struggling through and how we could move forward collectively.
Thank you, Yarimar. I will ask the second question. It's a question from Christian Vargas. Did you find in your research a Puerto Rican perspective on its relationship with food, especially knowing that pre and post Hurricane Maria, most of Puerto Rico's food has been imported from the United States? Do you believe that consciousness on where food is sourced from is changing?
Yeah, I think that's been changing for a while, but certainly Maria, was a catalyst for thinking about how, through the imposition of U.S.-led industrialization, we really neglected our agriculture, and Puerto Rico had come to a position of importing 80% of its food. And so I think there's been I know there's been a huge back to the land movement, and a growing kind of young farmers movement of folks trying to rethink, what sovereignty means, what self-reliance means through agriculture and through being able to produce our own food. And so that combined also with greater consciousness of, as there is worldwide, of the effects of companies like Monsanto that is operating here in Puerto Rico, and the kind of, you know, ecological damage that industrialization has caused. So I think overall, you know, people are really trying to think differently about the food that they eat and how they take care of themselves. Also, just generally a kind of greater turn towards self-care as a political act.